The night in Anchorage carried a silence that was almost holy, as if the city itself had fallen into prayer under the weight of the snow. Each flake fell slowly, softly, blanketing the streets until every sound was swallowed whole. There were no footsteps, no cars, no voices, just the deep, endless quiet that came with the Alaskan winter. But inside the small cabin near Ship Creek, that silence had been broken hours ago by something unholy. Detective Mara Hensley stood in the doorway, her breath misting the air, the smell of iron and decay crawling up her nose. The body seated at the kitchen table did not look human anymore. It looked like a wax figure left too close to the fire, skin stretched, frozen mid-expression, eyes glassy and unblinking. Walter Pike had died staring into nothing, his face locked in terror as though he had seen something the mind couldn't comprehend. The scene was disturbingly deliberate. The man's body sat upright, posture rigid, his right hand resting on a cup of coffee that had gone stone cold. The steam had long faded, but the faint trace of cinnamon still lingered, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. On the wall behind him, written in crude letters that seemed smeared by gloved fingers, were two words that chilled Mara more than the corpse itself. History repeats. The letters dripped down the wooden wall like fresh wounds. She stared at them unblinking as the hum of the space heater filled the void between her and the dead. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin windows and the lights flickered. Her partner, Officer Dean Corbett, stood behind her, face pale under the flickering bulb. He had seen many things in his years on the force, accidents, suicides, murders, but something about this was different. It was too methodical, too theatrical. "Looks ritualistic," he muttered, pulling his scarf higher around his face. Mara said nothing. She stepped closer to the table, eyes scanning the piles of papers and books that covered every inch of it. Pike's obsession was well known in Anchorage. He wasn't just a historian. He was a hunter of ghosts, Alaska's forgotten crimes, vanished settlements, unsolved murders. He'd spent years collecting everything he could about what he called the lost chapters of Alaskan history. Mara brushed her gloved fingers across the topmost file. Its label faded but still legible. Black Hollow, 1979. She had heard the name once, maybe twice. Buried in departmental archives. An abandoned mining settlement, wiped out by what had been officially ruled as a series of accidents. But Pike's notes told a different story. The pages were filled with photos of missing people, newspaper clippings yellowed with time, names scribbled in the margins. It was clear he had been piecing something together. And now he was dead. Her eyes drifted to a journal lying near his right elbow, the cover cracked and worn. She flipped it open to the last page. There was handwriting, shaky but desperate, as if written in fear. It read, "They found me. The truth isn't buried deep enough. If you're reading this, don't trust anyone who carries a badge older than your own." Mara's breath caught. The words were uneven, rushed, ending mid-sentence as if Pike had been interrupted. She looked at his face again, and the fear there made sense now. He hadn't died surprised. He had died expecting it. The coroner arrived minutes later, along with the evidence team. The tiny cabin quickly filled with people, cameras flashing, gloves rustling, questions floating through the air. But Mara barely heard them. Her mind was elsewhere, on those words, that warning. The phrase on the wall repeated in her head like a whisper she couldn't shut out. History repeats. She stepped outside to clear her thoughts. The cold hit her like a wall. The night was darker now, the snow falling thicker, and the faint sound of the river nearby blended with the low groan of the wind. She walked toward Pike's old truck parked by the cabin, its engine covered in frost. The passenger seat was filled with more papers and an old recorder. She reached in, brushed the snow off, and clicked play. Pike's voice filled the air, weak and trembling. "It started in Black Hollow," he said. "They said it was the storm that killed them, but the storm didn't start until after the first scream." A faint sound followed, something like scratching, then static. The recording ended abruptly. Her pulse quickened. She played it again, hoping to catch something new, but it ended the same way. Dean called from the porch. "You okay out there?" She turned off the recorder and slipped it into her coat pocket. "Yeah," she lied. But she wasn't. There was something under her skin, something cold and electric. Pike had uncovered something he wasn't supposed to, and someone had made sure he couldn't speak about it again. As they left the cabin, Mara glanced one last time at the frozen window. Through the frost, she saw the faint reflection of the crime scene behind her. The body, the blood, the words. For a brief moment, she thought she saw movement, a shape behind Pike's chair, almost like a shadow leaning close. But when she blinked, it was gone. She told herself it was just her mind playing tricks in the flickering light. Yet as the car pulled away, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't leaving something behind. Something was leaving with them. Back at the precinct, the case began to unravel like a thread being pulled from a sweater. Pike's files revealed layers of history that made little sense. A string of disappearances in the late 70s. Entire families wiped off the records. Official reports altered or missing altogether. He had highlighted a name that appeared again and again. Cyrus Bell, a trapper accused of killing 7 townsfolk before vanishing into the wilderness. But beside that name, Pike had scrawled another in red ink. False lead. Underneath, in smaller letters, the killer wore a badge. Mara sat in the dim light of her office, the heater humming beside her, the sound of distant sirens barely audible through the storm. She stared at that line until the words blurred. If what Pike believed was true, then someone from inside law enforcement had been responsible for a massacre that was never meant to see the light of day. And now, decades later, someone was ensuring it stayed that way. She closed the file slowly, pressing her hands against her face. She could feel the case already pulling her in, the way only the dark ones did. When she finally left the station, the snow had stopped. The city was eerily quiet again, blanketed under the weight of white. Her car sat alone in the parking lot, its windows glazed with frost. She climbed in, started the engine, and sat for a moment watching the ice melt from the glass. Then her headlights flicked across something, a figure standing at the far end of the lot watching her. The silhouette was still, shoulders broad, face hidden in the dark. When she blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only footprints leading toward the road already filling with snow. That night Mara couldn't sleep. The silence of Anchorage pressed against her walls. She poured herself a glass of whiskey and sat by the window, staring at the faint glow of the city below. In her mind, she replayed Pike's final hours, trying to piece together what he might have discovered that was worth killing for. But as the clock ticked toward dawn, one thought repeated itself, louder and clearer with each passing hour. Whatever had started in Black Hollow hadn't ended there. It had just been waiting, and now it had begun again. 3 days after Walter Pike's body was found, Alaska woke up to another nightmare. This time it wasn't in Anchorage. It was in Fairbanks, nearly 300 miles north, a city buried in snow and silence where the cold itself could kill a man faster than a bullet. The victim was a retired police officer named David Lorne, 62 years old, found dead in his home on the outskirts of town. His face was twisted in the same silent scream as Pike's, and just like before, the message was painted on the wall in dark, clotted strokes. History repeats. The same signature, the same ritual, but this one hit closer to the department's heart. Lorne had been one of their own, a man who'd worn the badge for nearly 40 years. Detective Mara Hensley stared at the crime scene through a veil of her own breath. The house was small and plain, walls lined with the kind of trophies and commendations that belong to a life of service. Family photos, certificates, the dull gleam of old medals, all reminders that David Lorne had once been celebrated for his work. But now that legacy was painted over in blood. The scene felt almost identical to Pike's cabin. the body seated, expression of horror, an untouched cup of coffee beside him. It was no coincidence. Whoever was doing this wanted them to see the connection. They were building a story, one corpse at a time. Mara knelt beside the old man's hand. His fingers were stiff, curved inward as though clutching at something invisible. His eyes were still open, pupils wide and clouded. He hadn't fought. He hadn't even moved. He'd sat down, taken his final breath, and waited for death to come. That kind of stillness spoke of fear beyond comprehension. She felt her stomach twist as she stood and looked around the room. The air carried a strange, faint scent, something earthy and metallic, almost like rust mixed with pine. She didn't like it. Dean Corbett stepped into the room, brushing snow from his jacket. "You're thinking what I'm thinking," he said quietly. Mara didn't answer. He continued, "It's not random. Whoever killed Pike knew about Lorne. They're connected somehow." Mara finally looked at him. Not just somehow. Directly. She turned back toward the wall of the room where a corkboard hung, covered in faded photos and newspaper clippings. At the center of it was a black and white image of a mining settlement. Half-collapsed houses buried under snow. The caption read, "Black Hollow, 1979. Mara's chest tightened. The same name that had been in Pike's files. She took a step closer and scanned the articles pinned around the photo. They were old, some dating back 40 years, recounting what had been dismissed as a tragic winter disaster, a blizzard that had buried an entire town. But in the margins, someone had written notes in pen, angry scribbles that contradicted every line of the official story. Words like cover-up, murders, missing reports, and circled 3 times in red ink was a single phrase: the Bell case. Dean leaned over her shoulder. "You think Pike told him something?" Mara nodded slowly. Or maybe Lorne was part of it. They spent hours combing through the house, searching for anything that could tie the 2 murders together. That's when Mara found it. An old box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Lorne's study. Inside were files wrapped in yellowed paper, the kind that smelled of dust and secrets. She pulled one open and froze. It was a copy of a police report dated March 18, 1979. The header read, "Black Hollow Incident." The report described a series of disappearances within the mining community. It mentioned the same man Pike had been researching, Cyrus Bell, the trapper accused of murdering several residents before disappearing into the wilderness. But at the bottom of the report, someone had crossed out the name Cyrus Bell and written a chilling note in the margin. He was never real. Mara's fingers trembled as she read it again. He was never real. The idea sent a shiver down her spine. The story everyone believed for decades, the mad trapper who slaughtered a town, might have been a fabrication. A cover-up. And if Pike and Lorne had both been digging into it, then someone was still protecting that lie even now. That night, Mara flew to the nearest station with jurisdiction over the old Black Hollow region. It wasn't easy to find. The area had long been declared uninhabitable after repeated avalanches and infrastructure decay. The few who remembered it called it cursed. When she arrived, she met a park ranger named Jace Harlow, a man who looked like he'd spent most of his life wrestling with the wilderness. His eyes were sharp, but his voice was low and cautious. "You're looking for Black Hollow," he said as they stood near his snow-covered jeep. "Nobody's lived there in decades. Hell, half the buildings are gone. Why the sudden interest?" Mara showed him a photo of the crime scene. "Because someone's bringing it back." He studied the picture quietly, the color draining from his face. "You don't want to go there," he said finally. "It's not just abandoned, it's wrong. I've been there twice. Every time it feels like something's still watching." But Mara wasn't easily shaken. She insisted he take her, and by dawn they were on the road, miles of frozen silence stretching before them. The drive was treacherous, with snow piling high on the sides of the narrow trail. The sky above was pale and heavy, the kind of gray that felt endless. When they finally reached the remnants of Black Hollow, Mara understood what he'd meant. The town was nothing more than a collection of broken structures scattered among skeletal trees. Roofs had caved in, windows shattered, walls collapsed under years of snow. Yet it wasn't just decay. It was eerily preserved, as if time had stopped mid-breath. The air was still, thick with a strange quiet that felt almost alive. She stepped out of the jeep, boots sinking into the powder, and the sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears. She walked slowly through the ruins, scanning the remains of a small police outpost near the center. The sign above the door was barely legible, eaten away by rust. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell of old paper and rot hit her immediately. Inside, filing cabinets lay overturned, their drawers empty or frozen shut. But one cabinet had been forced open recently. The snow around it was disturbed, footprints faint but fresh. Someone had been here, and not long ago. She crouched to examine them. They were large booted prints, possibly male, and led out the back door into the woods. The trail disappeared quickly under fresh snowfall. She looked up, eyes scanning the tree line. For a moment she thought she saw movement, a flicker of shadow slipping between the trees, but when she blinked, it was gone. Then she saw it. Hanging from a nearby tree, just visible through the snow, was a wooden sign. She walked toward it, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The sign was cracked, half buried in ice, the words carved by hand. "Welcome back." Her stomach turned. She could feel the cold sinking deeper, not just into her skin but into her bones. Whoever had killed Pike and Lorne was here. They had walked these same steps. Maybe they were still here. Watching her now, Jace called out from behind her, voice trembling. "We should go. It's getting dark." Storm's coming, but Mara wasn't listening. She was staring at the sign. The carving too precise to be old. It was recent. Fresh wood shavings still clung to the edges. Someone had made it to greet her. She took a photo, then turned back toward the jeep. As she walked, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. The trees swayed gently, the wind whispering through the branches. But over that, she could have sworn she heard something else. A faint laugh, echoing far off in the woods, a sound that didn't belong to anything living. Back in the jeep, Jace's hand shook as he started the engine. "Told you," he muttered, eyes locked on the road. "That place doesn't forget." Mara didn't respond. She was staring out the window, her mind turning over the words she'd just seen. "Welcome back." Whoever this was, they knew about her. They knew she'd come. And as the storm began to swallow the road behind them, she realized something even worse. The message wasn't just for her. It was for all of them. The ones still digging, still trying to uncover the truth that Alaska had buried in its frozen heart. Sleep came to Mara Hensley in fragments, stolen by whispers that refused to fade when morning came. For 3 nights after visiting Black Hollow, she dreamed of snow stretching endlessly into darkness, of faces half buried in frost, their eyes wide and glassy like Walter Pike's. She would wake drenched in cold sweat, her heartbeat thundering in her ears, the sound of faint laughter lingering like smoke in the air. She stopped trying to sleep after that. Her apartment became a fortress of light, lamps burning through the night, blinds drawn tight, the silence pressing against her windows like a living thing. Each day brought new pieces of the puzzle, each darker than the last. Pike's old notes had been logged as evidence, but Mara had made copies before turning them in. She spread them across her kitchen table, connecting them with string and scribbled notes like a madwoman mapping the veins of a monster. The pattern was clearer now. Every victim, both past and present, was tied to the original Black Hollow investigation. There had been 10 officers assigned to the case back in 1979. 3 had since died accidentally. A fall from a roof, a hunting mishap, a car crash on the icy Seward highway. Now Pike and Lorne made 5. 5 dead in the last 6 months. Someone was cleaning house. Dean noticed the change in her first. He found her at her desk one night long after everyone else had gone home, eyes bloodshot, fingers trembling over photos of old badges and faces long forgotten. "You haven't gone home in 2 days," he said, setting a cup of coffee in front of her. "You think this is healthy?" She looked up at him, eyes dark with exhaustion. "It's not about health anymore. It's about truth. Something happened in Black Hollow that was never supposed to see daylight. They blamed it on a trapper, but Pike was right. Cyrus Bell never existed. He was a name invented to keep the real story buried." Dean frowned. "So what's the real story?" Mara flipped a photograph toward him. It showed a man in uniform standing with a group of officers, his smile wide but his eyes hollow. "This is Captain Warren Rowe. He led the original investigation. Look at this." She pulled another photo from the pile, one taken the week before Pike died. In the background of a town meeting, Rowe stood among the attendees, much older now but unmistakably the same man. Dean leaned forward. "You think Rowe's behind it? The man's a legend. He's practically the reason this department still has a reputation." "Exactly," she said, "and legends make the best masks." That night Mara drove to Rowe's residence without clearance. His cabin sat by the edge of Turnagain Arm, perched over the frozen water. The place was immaculate, too perfect. Not a single footprint marked the fresh snow. She approached slowly, her breath fogging in the freezing air, and peered through the window. Inside she could see Rowe sitting by the fire, reading a book. The image was almost peaceful, too peaceful. She was about to turn away when something on his mantle caught her attention. A badge. Not his own. It was old, tarnished, and red-stained. Her stomach twisted. She had seen that same badge before. It was the one that had been left on her doorstep 2 nights ago with the note, "You're next in line." Mara stepped back from the window, heart hammering. She could feel the cold creeping into her bones. She knew she needed proof, something tangible. She slipped around the back, saw the faint light of a basement window, and crouched low to look inside. What she saw made her blood run colder than the snow beneath her knees. The basement walls were lined with photographs, some new, some decades old. Every single one was of victims, Pike, Lorne, and others she didn't recognize. But what stopped her breath entirely was the last photo on the far wall, her own. She stumbled back, almost slipping on the ice. She didn't wait to see more. She drove away with shaking hands, her headlights cutting through the falling snow like weak blades. By the time she reached Anchorage, the roads were empty, the city asleep. She didn't tell Dean. She didn't file a report. She just sat in her car outside the precinct, staring at her reflection in the windshield, trying to steady her breathing. The killer wasn't just someone inside the system. He was the system. The next morning, she received an anonymous package at her desk. No return address. Inside was a VHS tape wrapped in brown paper. A note was taped to it. "If you want to know why they died, watch this." There was a faint trace of old smoke on the paper, and something about the handwriting felt familiar. She locked herself in the evidence room and played the tape on one of the old monitors. The footage flickered to life in grainy black and white. It showed a snow-covered field, floodlights cutting through the darkness, and several men in police jackets standing over a row of bodies. A voice, distorted but calm, narrated softly over the wind. They thought they could keep it quiet. The miners had found something they shouldn't have. Not gold, not silver, bones, old bones, the kind that rewrite history. Mara's pulse quickened as she leaned closer. The camera panned over what looked like human remains. Skulls, ribs, vertebrae, but they were wrong. Misshapen. Some too large, others fused in ways that didn't seem possible. The men in the footage were arguing, voices muffled by the storm. One of them, tall, broad-shouldered, raised his rifle. The rest turned on him, shouting, but the gunfire drowned them out. The screen blurred as chaos erupted, the camera falling sideways. The last thing visible before the tape cut to static was that same tall man standing over the fallen, the light reflecting off his badge. Mara paused the tape. She rewound it, froze the frame on the man's face. It was Roe, 40 years younger but unmistakable. Her stomach dropped. Pike had been right. The Black Hollow killings weren't murders out of madness. They were a massacre, one orchestrated and covered up by law enforcement. The supposed trap killings had been an execution to silence witnesses. The trapper was a ghost story created to hide the truth. She sat in the dark for a long time, the hum of the monitor filling the silence. When she finally stepped outside, dawn was breaking, a pale light creeping across the horizon. Dean was waiting for her near her car, his expression tense. "You've been off the grid for 12 hours, he said. "What the hell's going on, Mara?" She hesitated. "Dean, I found something. Something big." Before she could say more, her phone buzzed. A message. "Unknown number." It read, "You shouldn't have watched that." Her breath caught in her throat. She scanned the parking lot, her eyes darting across the rows of cars, the rooftops, the windows above. Someone was watching. She could feel it. The same presence she'd felt in the woods of Black Hollow, invisible but near. Dean saw the color drain from her face. "Mara?" he said. She pocketed her phone, forcing her voice steady. "We need to find everything Pike had on Roe, everything." But when they returned to evidence, Pike's files were gone. Every single folder, every photo, every note vanished. The clerk on duty swore he hadn't seen anyone come or go. Mara's chest tightened. The erasure was complete. Pike's research, the tape, even the footprints she'd seen in the snow. All of it was being wiped clean as if it had never existed. That night she returned home to find her apartment door slightly open. Her gun was in her hand before she stepped inside. The lights were off, but she didn't need them to see the faint trail of wet footprints leading across her floor. They stopped at her kitchen table, at the map of Alaska she'd left spread out. Someone had been there studying it. On the map over the spot where she'd circled Black Hollow, a fresh red X had been drawn. Her phone buzzed again. A new message. This one read, "If you want to live, stop digging." She stood there for a long time, staring at the message until her vision blurred. Then she looked out the window. Across the street, half hidden by the shadows of the snow-covered trees, she saw him. Roe, watching. His face pale in the moonlight, a small smile curving his lips. He lifted his hand and made a slow, deliberate motion across his throat. Then he turned and walked away into the white night. Mara didn't sleep that night either. She sat at the window until morning, the city silent below her, the snow falling heavier by the hour. She finally understood what Pike had written before he died. The truth wasn't buried deep enough, and it never would be. Because the people who buried it weren't ghosts from the past. They were alive, wearing new uniforms, walking the same halls she did every day, and they were coming for her next. The storm rolled in from the coast like a living thing, swallowing the horizon in white. By the time Mara reached the edge of the old road leading back to Black Hollow, visibility had fallen to near zero. The snow came down in heavy sheets blanketing her windshield, turning every shadow into a ghost. The wipers could barely keep up. She drove with her jaw clenched, hands locked on the wheel, her heart beat louder than the radio static that filled the car. She had made her choice. There was no turning back. Captain Warren Roe had built his empire on the bones of the dead, and tonight, she was going to end it. For hours she followed the frozen path that led toward the abandoned mining town, her headlights carving through the storm like twin blades of pale gold. The world outside was an endless blur of white and dark, a place where nothing seemed alive except the wind. She replayed the tape in her mind again and again. The massacre, the screams, the moment Roe turned on his own men. She thought of Pike, of Lorne, of every name that had been erased. The truth had waited in the ice for decades, patient and silent, but it was awake now and it was watching. When she finally reached the ruins, her car's engine was the only sound in the void. Black Hollow looked almost unrecognizable beneath the snow. The remnants of the houses were mounds of white, their roofs collapsed under years of neglect. The water tower was half buried, its rusted frame jutting from the earth like broken bones. Mara stepped out into the cold, her boots sinking deep into the powder. The wind howled around her, dragging her hair across her face like fingers. She adjusted her coat and drew her gun, her flashlight cutting through the swirling flakes. She didn't know if Ro would come, but some part of her was certain he would. He'd been waiting for this moment longer than she had. She took shelter inside the old police outpost. The building groaned under the weight of the storm, the wood creaking and the wind seeping through the cracks. She found an old stove, lit it with the matches she'd brought, and sat in the dim orange glow, her breath visible in the cold air. The flame flickered, shadows stretching long and thin across the walls. On the desk lay remnants of old files, half-frozen pages and the decayed remains of a uniform that still bore the faded insignia of the Fairbanks Division. Time had devoured everything here, but the ghosts remained. The radio on her belt crackled suddenly and her hand flew to it. A voice came through, distorted by static. "Detective Hensley." "You shouldn't have come." The voice was calm, steady, but she recognized it instantly. Ro. Her grip on the radio tightened. "You're the one who should have stayed buried," she said. The reply came after a long pause, carried on the hiss of the storm. "You don't understand what you're standing in, Mara. This land doesn't forget. The blood here runs deeper than you think." She turned the radio off and waited. The minutes stretched into hours. The storm grew louder, angrier, until it felt like the entire mountain was roaring. Then through the howl of the wind she heard it, footsteps crunching in the snow. Slow, measured, each one deliberate. She stood and aimed her gun at the door. The steps stopped just outside. For a heartbeat there was nothing but silence. Then the door creaked open and Ro stepped inside. He looked older than he had through the glass that night outside her apartment. The storm had carved lines into his face, his gray hair damp with snow. But his eyes, those calm, calculating eyes, were the same. He closed the door behind him and removed his gloves, setting them neatly on the table beside him. "You really are relentless," he said softly, almost admiringly. "Pike said the same thing once. Did you kill him yourself?" Mara asked, her voice steady despite the pulse in her throat. Ro smiled faintly. "He left me no choice. He wanted to bring back what should have stayed forgotten. Men like him don't understand that history isn't meant to be rewritten, it's meant to be buried." "You buried a town," she said. "You buried families. You killed your own men." He sighed as though she were a child who just didn't understand. "You've seen the footage. You know what they found out there in the ice. Those bones. They weren't human. We were ordered to contain it, to erase it. I followed orders. Everyone did, until fear made them weak." Mara took a step forward, her gun steady. "So you decided to become the monster yourself." Ro's expression hardened. "I became what was necessary. Alaska is built on secrets, detective. The land itself is cursed with them. Every missing hiker, every lost plane, every town swallowed by snow, those aren't accidents. This state hides what the rest of the world shouldn't see, and I've been keeping it that way." She could hear the madness beneath his calm, a conviction so absolute it almost sounded like faith. He took another step toward her, his shadow stretching across the floor. "You're part of it now. You've seen the truth, and that means you don't get to walk away." The room exploded into motion. Ro lunged first, faster than she expected for a man his age. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The shot grazed his shoulder, spinning him slightly, but he didn't fall. He grabbed her wrist, slamming her hand against the wall. The gun clattered to the floor. She drove her knee into his chest, breaking free, diving for the weapon. He was on her again before she could aim, his hands closing around her throat. His grip was iron, his face twisted with something between fury and regret. "You could have been one of us," he hissed. "You could have kept the peace." Her vision blurred. The edges of the room darkened. She clawed at his arm, her fingers brushing the edge of the old badge pinned to his coat. With the last of her strength, she ripped it free and drove it into his neck. He stumbled back, choking, his hands clutching the wound. Blood darkened the snow-dusted floorboards. Mara gasped for air, snatched the gun, and fired again. The shot echoed through the storm. Roe fell to his knees, eyes wide with shock, and then collapsed. For a long moment there was no sound but the wind. Mara stood trembling, the gun still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. Then she lowered it and walked toward him. Roe's lips moved faintly, forming words she almost couldn't hear. "You think it ends with me," he whispered, blood staining his teeth. "It never ends. The ice remembers." His eyes glazed over and his body went still. Mara stared down at him, her chest heaving. She had killed him, but the victory felt hollow. The storm outside raged louder, as if the land itself was mourning or warning. She stepped outside, the cold biting her skin, and watched as the snow began to bury the footprints around the outpost. In minutes it would be as if nothing had ever happened. The evidence, the blood, even the body, swallowed by the endless white. When dawn broke, the storm finally eased. The first light of morning spilled across the horizon, turning the snow a pale gold. Mara stood by the frozen creek, her coat pulled tight around her, the wind whispering through the empty streets of Black Hollow. The world was silent again, the kind of silence that comes after violence. She knew the official report would never tell the truth. It would say Roe died in the line of duty, that she had uncovered corruption, that the past had finally been put to rest. But she knew better. The truth would die again, just as it always had. She turned to leave, her boots crunching in the snow. As she walked toward her car, she caught something in the corner of her eye, a shape in the distance, half buried under ice. She approached it cautiously, brushing the snow away. It was an old sign, cracked and splintered, with faded letters carved into the wood. "Welcome back." Her breath caught. For a moment she swore she heard movement beneath the ice, a low, distant rumble like something shifting far below the surface. She stepped back slowly, heart pounding, and the wind carried a whisper across the frozen air, so faint it almost sounded like a voice. "History repeats." Mara turned and didn't look back. The drive out of Black Hollow was long and silent, the road behind her already vanishing under the snow. But as she reached the main highway, she glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. For just a second, in the reflection of her taillights, she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. Tall, motionless, watching. Then it was gone, swallowed by the storm. She pressed harder on the gas, her breath fogging the windshield. She didn't know if what she'd seen was real or just the echo of her fear. But one thing was certain. The past never stayed buried in Alaska. It only waited, cold and patient, for someone new to remember.